Ionic bond explained. In this video, you will fully understand how ionic bonds are formed between atoms. First of all, you need to understand how we can define ionic bond. Keep in mind, the bond which is formed between two atoms after complete transfer of electrons is called ionic bond. Now, we also need to understand, what does complete transfer of electrons mean? Keep in mind, complete transfer of electrons means one atom completely gives away its electron and another atom completely accepts that electron. In simple words, one atom loses electron and another atom gains electron. Usually, the atom that loses electron is a metal, and the atom that gains electron is a nonmetal. So metals lose electrons and nonmetals gain electrons. When this transfer of electrons happens between two atoms, an ionic bond is formed between them. If to understand ionic bond formation deeply, we will study two important examples. In the first example, we will see how sodium and chlorine form an ionic bond to make sodium chloride. In the second example, we will understand how magnesium and oxygen form an ionic bond to make magnesium oxide. These two examples will make the concept completely clear. Let us start with the first example. That is formation of sodium chloride. The formula is NaCl. First of all, you need to understand that sodium is a metal. Sodium belongs to group 1 of the periodic table. The atomic number of sodium is 11. This means sodium has 11 electrons in its atom. If we look at the electronic configuration of sodium, it is 281. This means sodium has 2 electrons in the first shell, 8 electrons in the second shell, and only 1 electron in the outermost shell. Now, sodium wants to complete its octet. To complete its octet, sodium needs to lose 1 electron from its outermost shell. When sodium loses 1 electron, it will have 8 electrons in its outermost shell, and its octet will be complete. So sodium loses 1 electron. When sodium loses 1 electron, a positive charge appears on sodium. Now questions is that why positive charge appears on sodium? The reason is simple, because sodium lost a negatively charged electron. So sodium becomes positively charged. We write it as sodium with a plus sign. This is called sodium ion. Now let's talk about chlorine. The atomic number of chlorine is 17. This means chlorine has 17 electrons. The electronic configuration of chlorine is 287. This means chlorine has 7 electrons in its outermost shell. Chlorine also wants to complete its octet. To complete its octet, chlorine needs 1 more electron. So chlorine needs to gain 1 electron. The 1 electron that sodium lost, chlorine will gain that electron. When chlorine gains 1 electron, it will have 8 electrons in its outermost shell, and its octet will be complete. When chlorine gains 1 electron, a negative charge appears on chlorine. And this happens because chlorine gained a negatively charged electron. So chlorine becomes negatively charged. We write it as chlorine with a minus sign. This is called chloride ion. Now observe carefully. Sodium has positive charge, and chlorine has negative charge. We know that opposite charges attract each other. So sodium ion with positive charge will attract chloride ion with negative charge. These two ions come close to each other due to electrostatic attraction, and a bond is formed between them. Now the question is, why do we call this bond an ionic bond? The answer is simple, because this bond was formed after complete transfer of electrons. Sodium completely transferred its electron to chlorine. Both atoms completed their octet through this electron transfer. This is why the bond between sodium and chlorine is called ionic bond. Now I want to tell you a very important trick. Always remember this trick. Whenever a group 1 element forms a bond with a group 7 element, that bond will always be an ionic bond. The reason is very simple. All group 1 elements like lithium, sodium, and potassium have 1 electron in their outermost shell. They always lose 1 electron to complete their octet. On the other hand, all group 7 elements like fluorine, chlorine, and bromine have 7 electrons in their outermost shell. They always gain 1 electron to complete their octet. So when group 1 elements meet group 7 elements, complete transfer of electrons happens. Group 1 element loses 1 electron, and group 7 elements gains 1 electron. Therefore, the bond between group 1 and group 7 is always ionic bond. Now, let's understand the second example. That is, formation of magnesium oxide. The formula is MgO. You need to understand that magnesium belongs to group 2 of the periodic table. The atomic number of magnesium is 12. This means magnesium has 12 electrons. The electronic configuration of magnesium is 282. Which means magnesium has 2 electrons in its outermost shell. To complete its octet, magnesium needs to lose 2 electrons from the outermost shell. When magnesium loses 2 electrons, it will have 8 electrons in its outermost shell, and octet will be complete. So magnesium loses 2 electrons. When magnesium loses 2 electrons, a positive charge of +2 appears on magnesium. This happens because magnesium lost 2 negatively charged electrons. So we need to write it as Mg with +2 charge. This is called magnesium ion. Now let's talk about oxygen. The atomic number of oxygen is 8. This means oxygen has 8 electrons. The electronic configuration of oxygen is 2, 6. This means oxygen has 6 electrons in its outermost shell. To complete its octet, oxygen needs 2 more electrons. So oxygen needs to gain 2 electrons. The 2 electrons that magnesium lost, oxygen will gain those 2 electrons. When oxygen gains 2 electrons, it will have 8 electrons in its outermost shell, and octet will be complete. When oxygen gains 2 electrons, a negative charge of -2 appears on oxygen. Again, this happens because oxygen gained 2 negatively charged electrons. We need write it as oxygen with -2 charge. This is called oxide ion. Now see what happens. Magnesium has +2 charge and oxygen has -2 charge. These are opposite charges. Opposite charges attract each other strongly. So magnesium ion will attract oxide ion. These two ions come together due to electrostatic force of attraction, and a bond forms between them. This bond is called ionic bond, because this bond formed after complete transfer of 2 electrons from magnesium to oxygen. Both atoms achieved stable octet configuration through this electron transfer. Therefore, the bond in magnesium oxide is ionic bond. Now I will give you another important trick. Just like group 1 and group 7, there is a similar trick for group 2 and group 6 elements. Whenever a group 2 element forms bonds with a group 6 element, that bond will always be an ionic bond. Now let's understand, why does this happen? Let's explain the reason in detail. All group 2 elements like magnesium, calcium, and barium have 2 electrons in their outermost shell. To complete their octet, they always lose 2 electrons. On the other hand, all group 6 elements like oxygen and sulfur have 6 electrons in their outermost shell. To complete their octet, they always need to gain 2 electrons. So when group 2 elements react with group 6 elements, complete transfer of 2 electrons takes place. Group 2 elements lose 2 electrons, and group 6 elements gain 2 electrons. Both achieve stable configuration. Therefore, the bond between group 2 and group 6 is always ionic bond. Let me give you more examples. Calcium oxide is ionic compoundum because calcium is group 2 element and oxygen is group 6 element. So calcium oxide has ionic bond. Barium oxide is also ionic compound. Barium is group 2 element and oxygen is group 6 element. So barium oxide also has ionic bond. Magnesium sulfide is also ionic in nature. Magnesium is group 2 element and sulfur is group 6 element. So magnesium sulfide also has ionic bond. You can see the pattern clearly. Group 2 plus group 6 always equals ionic bond. Remember this trick. It will help you identify ionic compounds instantly in your exam. Now let's have a quick summary of our lecture. Keep in mind, ionic bond is formed when there is complete transfer of electrons from one atom to another atom. The atom that loses electrons becomes positively charged. The atom that gains electrons becomes negatively charged. These opposite charges attract each other and form ionic bond. We studied 2 examples. First example was sodium chloride. Sodium lost 1 electron and chlorine gained 1 electron. Ionic bond formed between them. Second example was magnesium oxide. Magnesium lost 2 electrons and oxygen gained 2 electrons. Ionic bond formed between them. We also learned 2 important tricks. First trick is group 1 plus group 7 always forms ionic bond. Second trick is group 2 plus group 6 always forms ionic bond. These tricks work because complete electron transfer happens between these groups. Therefore, ionic bonding is a simple concept if you understand the electron transfer process. Metals lose electrons and nonmetals gain electrons. This creates ions with opposite charges. These ions attract and form ionic bonds. Practice these examples and tricks. This will help you master ionic bonding and score excellent marks in chemistry.